Hare Krishna Prabhus. Thank you for welcoming me back to your Russian Sangha online. Today's lesson from the Founder-Acarya Essentials series is called Our Srila Prabhupada. On May 11th, 1969, the American counterculture poet Allen Ginsberg met with Srila Prabhupada at the Hare Krishna Temple in Columbus, Ohio, to discuss their program at the university the following evening, as well as how Krishna consciousness could spread widely in materialistic America. Alluding to a prophetic text from the Brahma Vaivarta Purana, Prabhupada assured the poet that people everywhere, quote, will take advantage of Hare Krishna for the next 10,000 years, unquote. Ginsberg had seen Prabhupada rouse crowds to chant Hare Krishna in New York and San Francisco, but the conservative students at the Ohio State University would present a special challenge. In his book, The Hare Krishna Explosion, Hayagriva Prabhu described what happened on the night of the event. After entering the auditorium, Prabhupada, smiling and glowing, ascended the stage where poet Ginsberg invited him to lead the chanting. Prabhupada started slowly, singing a simple melody, and gradually picked up the tempo while playing hand cymbals. Then, and this is a quote from the book, Prabhupada stands and raises his hands, inviting the students also to stand and dance. The response is immediate. Students in the aisles are first to their feet. Then students in the rows and balconies arise. There is little room for dancing. A spontaneous bounce catches hold instead. If you can imagine being in an auditorium where you're so packed with people that you just sort of together, you have this mass bounce, you're just bouncing in rhythm. As Prabhupada bounces on the dais, the students bounce also. As he waves his arms, they wave theirs. He leads them as a maestro conducts an orchestra, until gradually the inherent spiritual rhythm of the mantra itself prevails. The young voices empowered by the mantra, not even knowing the meaning of the words. Quote, the amazing fact is that everybody was able to get up and dance, says Ginsberg later, nearly leaping out of their skins. Had Prabhupada revealed the Puranic texts directly preceding the 10,000-year prophecy he had mentioned, poet Ginsberg would have likely claimed Prabhupada its fulfiller. In those texts, Lord Krishna tells the goddess Ganga that 5 millennia hence, he will send his mantra upasaka, worshipper of the holy names, to spread the chanting of Hare Krishna and purify earth, water, sky, and humanity everywhere. Quote, this period of worldwide chanting will continue for 10,000 years. That's from the Brahma Vaivarta Purana, 4.129.49 through 59. While fulfilling this and other Vedic prophecies, Prabhupada never once called attention to himself, instead calling everyone's attention to Krishna. Over the millennia, the Lord would set the stage of world history to send his, quote, worshipper of the holy names to just the right place, at just the right time, to launch the worldwide Hare Krishna movement. Alone. Alone in America. When Prabhupada's spiritual master, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, dispatched the first Vaishnava preachers from India to Europe in the 1930s, he gave them the full institutional support of his Gaudiya mission. But after Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's demise in 1937, the mission's leaders neglected their master's instructions to form a governing body and work cooperatively to spread Krishna consciousness. The infighting that ensued so fragmented the mission that by the time Prabhupada arrived in America to preach in 1965, there was no institution left to support him. In New York City, with almost no friends or funds, Prabhupada nonetheless saw a fertile preaching field in materially prosperous America, where people were spiritually starving and looking to the East for truth. Hopeful of reviving the cooperative spirit that once galvanized the Gaudiya mission, Prabhupada began writing his now isolated godbrothers, admonishing them to help him seize the time. The following excerpt from one such letter to the mission's former manager is telling. So this is a quote from, it's actually a letter to Bhaktivilas Tirtha Maharaj, Prabhupada's godbrother, 8th November 1965. Quote, I came here to study the situation and I find it very nice. And if you are also agreeable to cooperate, it will all be very nice by the will of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Prabhupada. If you agree, then take it for granted that I am one of the workers of the Sri Mayapur Chaitanya Mutt. That was Bhaktivilas Tirtha Maharaj's mutt. That was the headquarter mutt of what had been the Gaudiya mission. I have no ambition for becoming the proprietor of any mutt or mandir, but I want working facilities. A, quote, servant leader long before the phrase's time, Prabhupada would still receive no tangible cooperation from his godbrothers. With only the scriptures he translated, annotated, and brought from India to sustain him, Prabhupada endured, mostly alone, the brutal New York winter that followed, writing letters and translating the Bhagavad Gita. I lived through that winter too. It was historic. Just New York City, just under tons of snow and wicked Arctic-like winds. Because I was living just 30 miles from New York in a suburb. But Prabhupada had to endure that alone. From obscurity to Swamiji. The following spring, Prabhupada relocated to a loft in New York's infamous Bowery district. Rife with derelicts and crime, this district was dangerous. But Prabhupada took the risk to reach young seekers nearby. In the loft, Krishna sent Prabhupada a few regular listeners who came to his aid after his young LSD-crazed loftmate attacked, forcing him to flee. With the regulars' help, Prabhupada at last secured his own place, a cheap storefront on the city's Lower East Side. Forced by the non-cooperation of his godbrothers, Prabhupada dropped the attempt to revive his spiritual master's institution, and instead, on July 13, 1966, he officially launched, quote, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, unquote, a fresh branch of the same Gaudiya Sampradaya. Empowered by Srila Bhaktisiddhanta, Lord Chaitanya, Krishna's golden avatar, and his spiritual forefathers, Prabhupada inspired a growing flock of followers that summer to chant Hare Krishna and take up the process of Bhakti Yoga. No small miracle in New York City, the capital of, quote, do your own thing. He did it by stressing the do's more than the don'ts, the chanting more than the taboos. He had faith that as Krishna filled the consciousness of his young aspirants, they would outgrow their old ways and savor the higher taste of devotional service. It worked. By late November, after a few groups of devotees had received initiation, one of the earlier initiates approached Prabhupada. Swamiji, what did you say the rules are for this practice? Just what Prabhupada had been waiting to hear, for he knew they would follow the rules only when they were ready. The next day, November 25th, 1966, Prabhupada posted the regulative principles of Krishna consciousness on his apartment's bathroom door. And when by then there had already been 3 initiations. So when they actually read in print the rules, then they just couldn't believe it, because Prabhupada had not stressed them. He had mentioned them, so he had stressed them, and they just, some of them were just chuckling like, what? This is impossible. But they had already been committed, and they already had gotten a higher taste. So that was Prabhupada's transcendental trickery. They were already too awake. So they, even though it seemed like, how could they do it? But they were already doing it, so they kept going. Okay, that was 66. Only he could lead them. In January 1967, Prabhupada followed the counterculture trail to San Francisco, where disciples had opened ISKCON's second temple. There he inspired a new wave of devotees to chant Hare Krishna and serve Lord Chaitanya's mission. As in New York, the young aspirants marveled at Prabhupada's pace, a whirlwind of chanting, teaching, worshiping, cooking, public preaching, private speaking, initiating newcomers, and translating scripture in the wee hours, while everyone else slept. When Prabhupada returned to New York in April, despite his 70-plus years, the pace continued, unabated. For his first followers, this was all part of the wonder that was Swamiji. So, it was quite a shock when, toward the end of May, Prabhupada suffered a heart attack and a stroke. He was their absolute shelter. Now, they would have to shelter him. To help Prabhupada recuperate, the devotees brought him to a beach bungalow on the Jersey shore. But the weather was gray and blustery, so with the doctor's permission, Prabhupada flew to San Francisco, where the devotees hoped the California sunshine would heal him. Alas, not to be. When the mountains and fog near his cottage mostly obscured the sun's rays, Prabhupada said he would have to return to India for its Ayurvedic medicines and bracing heat. Also Ayurvedic massage, too. Hayagriva explained what happened next in that book, Hare Krishna Explosion. Here's the quote. Some of the devotees, worried that Swamiji has decided to go to India to leave his body, ask him whether, during his absence, one of his godbrothers should come to America to assume ISKCON leadership. The minute this question is presented to him, we sense that it is offensive. Swamiji becomes very grave, closing his eyes. Then suddenly, we see tears falling down his cheeks. My Guru Maharaj, he was no ordinary spiritual master, he says, wiping away the tears. He saved me. Later, Swamiji tells us what we should have always known. There is no one to replace him. The very idea is insulting. Quote, if someone comes and tells you something different, he says, you will be confused. Owing to his absolute surrender to Srila Bhaktisiddhanta and Lord Chaitanya's mission, Prabhupada knew he was being uniquely empowered to turn people outside India's spiritual culture toward Krishna consciousness, and that only he could lead them. From Swamiji to Prabhupada. Although Prabhupada's uniqueness among contemporary gurus was obvious to his followers, they were still calling him Swamiji, a rather common address. In the spring of 1968, Krishna revealed an honorific more befitting Prabhupada's position. When a devotee learned that the Sanskrit affix ji was a term of endearment, he asked Prabhupada if he could add it to his wife's name, Govinda, and call her Govinda ji. No, actually, ji is a third-class form of address, Prabhupada replied. It's better not to call her Govinda ji. Govinda Dasi, a plain-spoken Texas lady, remembers the rest. So this is my god sister Govinda Dasi recalling how Swamiji became Prabhupada. Govinda says, so I piped up. I was sitting right in front of him, and I said, well, if it's a third-class form of address, why are we calling you Ji? Why are we calling you Swamiji? And he said, oh, it's not very important. And I said, oh, no, it's very important. If it's a third-class form of address, then we don't want to call you that. We want to call you the most first-class form of address. So tell us, what would be a good name for us to call you by? And he was very humble, very reluctant. But I pressed him. We've got to change this. And he said, oh, you can call me Gurudev or Guru Maharaj or Prabhupada. So I said, well, that's 3. We need 1. So, which one is the best? And he answered, Srila Prabhupada is nice. That is the best. So I said, from today, you will be called Srila Prabhupada. Never demanding respect, but nonetheless commanding it by his own endearing example, Prabhupada had seized Krishna's teachable moment to quietly disclose the appropriate address. In the disciplic line, there are many Gurudevs, but Prabhupada is a guru of gurus. Quote, a master at whose feet all masters sit. And now, Prabhu, since I'll finish reading soon, it's time for you to start thinking about questions and comments you'd like to make once I'm done. From Prabhupada to Founder-Acarya. In just 12 years, Prabhupada would circle the globe 14 times, initiate thousands of disciples, and establish the Krishna consciousness movement on every major continent. During his travels, he would found over 100 temples, schools, farms, and restaurants, all while writing and publishing dozens of translations and commentaries on foundational Vaishnava scriptures. But success would bring enemies too, the worst from within. In 1970, after critical remarks by a few of his godbrothers negatively influenced some of his leaders, Prabhupada asked a dozen trusted disciples to help him form a governing body commission as Srila Bhaktisiddhanta had requested his disciples, to protect ISKCON and ensure its continuance. On July 28th, a legal document called, quote, Direction of Management listed the GBC members and officially referred to, quote, His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, as ISKCON's Founder-Acarya. But bad signs persisted. On one of his books, his ISKCON Press identified the author as simply, quote, A.C. Bhaktivedanta, nearly stripping his name of any spiritual significance. When his new publishing house, the Bhaktivedanta Book Trust, moved into its headquarters, Prabhupada saw nothing on the building identifying the organization's name or founder. And when some of his temple presidents wrote him on their own stationery, Prabhupada had to tell them to write him on official temple stationery, displaying his full name and Founder-Acarya title. For good reason. One day, a non-complying temple president secretly sold the temple, collected the money, and disappeared. He, not ISKCON, had been the legal owner. After the last incident, in the summer of 1974, Prabhupada drafted an amendment to his earlier management document, including a strongly worded statement about his position and authority as ISKCON's Founder-Acharya. Quote, this is a quote from this amendment to the Directions of Management original document. Quote, it is declared that His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, is the Founder-Acharya of ISKCON, International Society for Krishna Consciousness. He is the supreme authority in all matters of the society. His position cannot be occupied by anyone else, and his name and title must appear on all documents, letterheads, publications, and buildings of the society. And today we could add, for the digital age, on our websites. Prabhupada has to be prominently displayed, promoted. That same summer, so this is 1974, the same summer he drafted the amendment, even as Prabhupada was reasserting his supreme position in ISKCON, while translating the Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, he also reasserted his and his followers' fidelity to Srila Bhaktisiddhanta in Lord Chaitanya's mission. So this is a quote from the CC purport. Quote, as members of the Krishna Consciousness movement, we belong to the family or disciplic succession of Saraswati Goswami, and thus we are known as Saraswats. Obeisances are therefore offered to the spiritual master as Saraswat Deva, or a member of the Saraswat family. Namaste, Saraswati Devi, whose mission is to broadcast the cult of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Gauravani Pracharane, and to fight with impersonalists and voidists. Nirvishesha, Shunyavadi, Paschatya Desha Tarini. That's from Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, Adi Lila 1084 purport. Prabhupada was hopeful that if his followers would do as he was doing, keeping his movement connected to its spiritual roots while creatively fulfilling Lord Chaitanya's desires, it would survive the ravages of time and eventually carry Krishna consciousness to every town and village on earth. Okay, Prabhus, I'll be very happy to receive your questions and comments now to this lesson I call Our Srila Prabhupada. Okay.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Yeah, we have some questions. Let's start with this one. How can we protect ISKCON from the fate of Gaudiya mass? From your talk today, what I've heard, we need GBC is one way. Having a GBC or the GBC is one way to do it, and also the position of Srila Prabhupada as Founder-Acarya. And what other tools do we have to prevent ISKCON from having the same fate as Gaudiya Math?
Yeah, good question. Yes. That was Prabhupada's main anxiety as he was leaving this world. And that's what the doctor, the Kaviraj, who was tending to Prabhupada, that was his diagnosis. Too much anxiety over disciples and movement. And Prabhupada said, yes, you have rightly diagnosed. So, a lot did happen after Prabhupada left, but because Prabhupada had established a GBC 7 years earlier, at least on paper, and for 7 years he was training his GBCs to take over the management. Not to replace him, you don't replace a Founder-Acarya, but you have people manage the mission. And that's what ultimate managing authority means. It doesn't mean that somehow the GBC is replacing Prabhupada. But now there has to be people who are alive on earth to practically manifest the preaching mission, to make sure that the mission is in line with Prabhupada's wishes, his desires, what he established while he was with us. So apart from the management structure, it's really the responsibility of every devotee, especially devotees in leading positions, to educate the newer devotees, the younger devotees, about Prabhupada's position as being the Founder-Acarya, which means that the Founder-Acarya is everybody's foundational spiritual master. So the duty of initiating and instructing spiritual masters who are on the planet is to deepen everyone's foundational relationship with Srila Prabhupada. And that way there'll be unity. Because we're so diverse materially. I mean, I'm speaking to you, and you have a totally different experience in Russia. You have a different language culture, you have different political history. Karmically, we're so different all over the world. Everybody's coming from a different karmic experience. But deeper than karma is the soul and our relationship with Krishna and our connection with Srila Prabhupada as being a very confidential servant of Krishna. So the Founder-Acarya provides the unity amidst our ever-increasing diversity, which allows us to cooperate. If I don't think I have anything in common with someone else, it's going to be very hard for me to work with that person. So similarly, all the countries of the world have different language cultures, different histories, different moods. So in order for us to go forward in a cooperative way, we have to make sure the Prabhupada really the center in a very practical way. So I think this came up before. I know you have the Lilamrita in Russian, so I always encourage people after I give my seminars in person, which I did in Kazan and St. Petersburg and Moscow. I said, so those of you who are inspired by this Founder-Acarya journey, these seminars, then you start your Lilamrita Sangha, start your Prabhupada Sangha, and then start thinking of something wonderful you can do to please Prabhupada based on your knowledge, because we'll have to know Prabhupada, his life, his teachings, his mood, his mission. So a Prabhupada-centered ISKCON is one that will survive the ravages of time, as I put it, and increase, not decrease. Because time only acts on the material energy. Everything over time decreases. They call this entropy in science. Everything moves from a state of wholeness, integrity, to dispersion and breaking up. But that's only the material energy. The spiritual energy, if we actually are living and working in the light of Prabhupada's instructions, then ISKCON will stay in the spiritual energy. And that energy is ever increasing. So, yeah, one thing we were speaking about before we went live with you all is this 6 years ago, this Founder-Acarya booklet that Nilangalata, her spiritual master Ravindra Sarup Prabhu, wrote on behalf of the GBC 6 years ago, which was accepted by the GBC as the Siddhanta on Prabhupada's position. We know it's translated into Russian and in a few other languages, but now we want to do audiobooks of this work because Kali Yuga is advancing and a lot of people find it hard to read these days. They find their lives are too busy or they're too spoiled by instant, internet, social media. And people don't have very long attention spans for reading, but they still like to hear. So we hope that we can have an audiobook for you Russian speakers before too long. So we'll see how that goes. Yeah, we just have to do all we can to make Srila Prabhupada our core identity, our foundational relationship, and that has to be promoted by leaders, because the followers believe the leaders. And then ISKCON will have a chance of surviving the ravages of time, which acts on the material energy, but not on the spiritual energy. So let's see. It's up to all of us. Those asking the questions, those giving the answers. That's what we have to do.
Yeah.
Hare Krishna.
Thank you. And the next question has two parts to it. First part, what sources of Prabhupada's instructions are most important for you personally? And the second part is, what would you say is the place of Prabhupada's letters in the hierarchy of Prabhupada's instructions?
Sati Prabhu, wasn't this the same questions we've been having?
No, I don't believe that.
No? Okay. I guess I'm doing too many zooming too many places. Okay, good. So two parts. One is, for me, what's Prabhupada's most important instruction? And the second one again was?
What is the place of Prabhupada's letters in the hierarchy of Prabhupada's instructions?
Okay. Yes. Okay. So for me, what's the most important instruction for me? Well, I think for me it's just what I call Prabhupada's Mahavakya, which we'll hear more about in Lesson 8. Today is Lesson 3. Lesson 8 I call To Love is to Cooperate. And Prabhupada was always telling us, both at the beginning and in the middle and the end of his Leela, cooperate, because he experienced what happens when devotees don't cooperate and compete and then fight. So that's what happened to the Gaudiya Math. So, yeah. So here I am, I'm living in Tucson, Arizona, and I can't think that just because I'm thinking now, yeah, I'm the oldest devotee here. 50 years in the movement, 73 years old. So if I were foolish, I could think, yeah, well, I know better than all these people. I've been around longer than them, materially and in the movement, spiritually. So I don't need to cooperate with them. But that's, if I think like that, that means I haven't learned one thing in 50 years. So I'm very careful to cooperate with these wonderful devotees here. We have a wonderful community director, a lady, Vaishnavi named Sandamani Devi Dasi, and she's great. So for me, it's what Prabhupada told us all. It's nothing special, nothing private for me. I didn't have that. As I've told you, I kept myself at a distance from Prabhupada because I was too afraid of him. His Krishna consciousness was a roaring fire, and I was a little teeny spark, just staying in the background. So, yeah, for me it's cooperate, and then the second one, okay, I forgot it again. Remind me again, Sati. What's the second part?
The place of letters.
Oh, the place of lectures or letters?
Letters.
Letters. Okay. Letters. Okay, letters.
Yeah. Postmail.
Okay.
Sorry,
right.
postmail.
Say it again?
Postmail.
Post, yeah. All right. Well, for me, they're very important. But at the same time, because they were written to individuals, we always have to know context. So sometimes when Prabhupada would write letters, he would make it very clear that he'd already answered this particular question before, and why should he have to answer the same question all the time? So copy this letter and circulate it everywhere. So those kinds of letters obviously were for public consumption. And Prabhupada never, actually he did on occasion say that what he was telling a specific individual is not for public consumption. It's just for him, and it's a very sensitive matter. But by and large, when Prabhupada wrote letters, because think about it, the books gradually did come out, but especially in the early days, Prabhupada started writing letters. Yeah, he wrote, well, especially after he left New York City, then that was the only way to communicate with Prabhupada, starting in 1967, yeah. And so those letters were very important to the devotees. And whenever a letter would come, I describe it like a little, because he Prabhupada generally would write on these pale blue aerograms that you could write on the front and the back. He never wasted any space or any money or any time. Prabhupada showed us by his example how to use Krishna's energy very carefully. So these letters would float in, from Goloka. That's how it seemed. These little pale blue aerograms, messages. And whenever a letter would float in, then it was a big event, and we'd all gather around. Because we all lived in the temple in those days. We didn't have our own private addresses, so they would all come addressed to whatever temple we happened to be in. And so whenever a letter came from Prabhupada, it was like, Hare Krishna Prabhus! Someone in the temple has just received a letter from Srila Prabhupada. So let's all hear it. So we'd eagerly gather around the devotee as he opened his letter very carefully, and then he would read it, and that was amazing. So a lot of the things that Prabhupada said weren't just for that person, they were for so many, they were like special instructions. And then but it's also important because we didn't necessarily know what the person had written Prabhupada. So for example, I'm hearing right now some audio talks from Harishari Prabhu, who wrote Transcendental Diaries. And to do the research for his diaries, even though he had his diary, that's his primary source, he also used a I think there's about 500 letters at the Bhaktivedanta Archives in Sandy Ridge, North Carolina, where Prabhupada's archives has a home. And they actually have, it might be more now, but they have several hundred letters written to Prabhupada. So when Harishari was writing his diary books, he was given an opportunity because of the nature of his work, his important diary work, historical document. He was given access to those letters, so he could see what the devotees, at least in some cases, had written to Prabhupada. Prabhupada wrote around 7,000 letters. It's almost up to 7,000 now in the latest edition of the Vedabase. But we don't know, in most cases, what Prabhupada had written, or what the devotee had written to Prabhupada. So we have, less than 1,000 letters written to Prabhupada. So it's important to know context. So sometimes when Prabhupada is writing, then it's just for that devotee, and sometimes it's for everybody. So we have to be sensitive to that. So in the hierarchy, as you say, of Prabhupada's Vani, we always take Prabhupada's books as number one, as supreme. Because, as Prabhupada once told a reporter, a journalist, the journalist said, "What will happen when you die?" And Prabhupada said, "I will never die. I will live forever in my books. And you will utilize." And elsewhere he said, "My books will be the law books for mankind for the next 10,000 years." So the books are for everybody. General instructions, general principles, generally. I'm talking generally now. But when you come to the morning walks and the room conversations and the letters, it's very useful to see how Prabhupada practically applies those principles in people's lives and in his own life. He would reveal, in those more intimate settings, how he would practice himself before coming to the West. And while he was circling the globe 14 times in 12 years, we were writing him about everything. Prabhupada had to teach us everything, from how to clean ourselves to, who God is, what God looks like. So there are so many applications of the principles in the books in these more intimate settings, room conversations, morning walks, letters. So I'd say they're very important. They're an essential complement to Prabhupada's Vani, to his books. Okay.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And the short question. We know you just mentioned that Srila Prabhupada approved the address Srila Prabhupada. Mm-hmm. If we call Prabhupada Swami Prabhupada, is it also legitimate?
If we call him what?
Swami Prabhupada.
Vani Prabhupada?
Swami.
V-A-N-I, Vani.
Swami. No. Swami.
Oh, Swami.
W-A-M.
Okay. Okay. Sorry. Swami Prabhupada. I've seen that done in certain contexts. Specifically, I'm thinking of, I was watching a podcast of my godbrother Garuda Prabhu, who was leading a remembrance of scholars in Boston. And when was it? I don't know, a few years ago. It was a memorial, it was a tribute. And when we talk about Prabhupada, it would sound strange for us to say Swami Prabhupada. We call him Srila Prabhupada because Srila is a more, deferential, it's a greater honorific. There are so many Swamis, right? So that does connect to the what I was speaking about, because if Prabhupada had simply said, "Call me Gurudev," or Guru Maharaj, that's an honorific. But when you talk about Prabhupada, that's a guru of gurus. So you're talking about a hybrid, a compound, Swami Prabhupada. Somehow when I saw and heard Guru to do this with these scholars, somehow it worked for me. It wasn't offensive because they're used to studying so many swamis, gurus, yogis. So, and the whole thing was a glorification of Prabhupada on how there were so many swamis, gurus, and yogis. But when you talk about Swami Prabhupada, he was above the rest. And that's what you get with Prabhupada, a guru of gurus. So he was a swami, and there are so many swamis, so many sannyasis. But when you talk about a Prabhupada, then it's a master of masters. So I would say it could be used carefully in certain contexts, like I saw amongst the scholars. But certainly we wouldn't do that amongst ourselves. It would sound weird. It would sound strange. But in that context, so, if you're wondering, then always consult.
Okay.
And then consult with somebody whom you consider to be, more advanced than you, and they will be able to tell you if it works in a certain context.
Thank you. And one more question, if we have time.
Yeah.
Toward the end, in the final part of your today's presentation, you were talking about Prabhupada's Pranam Mantra. Can you tell us more about who composed the Pranam Mantra for Srila Prabhupada, how it came to be, and how does it usually happens? How does a person, when he becomes a guru, gets a Pranam Mantra? I'm very curious.
Yes. Okay. Well, it was a unique, just like Prabhupada had to tell us everything, right? So traditionally, a guru's Pranam Mantra will come from the disciples, but we didn't know up from down practically. So I'll tell you historically when it came in. It came in when, as I mentioned, there was an unfortunate minimization of Prabhupada's position from some jealous godbrothers of Prabhupada, and it was affecting some ISKCON leaders. So the main way that Prabhupada protected ISKCON from this threat was he formed a GBC amongst disciples who were not affected by the minimization propaganda. And he asked 12 disciples originally. Most of them were householders, because there were hardly any sannyasis in the movement at the time. And they agreed to be on the governing body. They had no clue what that meant, but Prabhupada gradually educated them. And before Prabhupada did that, actually, he did something else. Because the minimization of Prabhupada coming from India was that Prabhupada had become successful because, he was a good businessman. That's what he was doing when he was in his householder ashram in India for decades. He knew how to recruit, he knew how to organize, he knew how to drum up business. So now he's doing, quote, spiritual business, and he's able to recruit disciples and raise money. And so that was the mundane minimization of Prabhupada. So to educate us exactly what his position was, which Krishna had revealed to Prabhupada between 1965 and 1970, Krishna revealed to Prabhupada that, look, they're not going to cooperate with you. They can't, because there's still too much bad feeling from what happened in the 1930s. They were all fighting each other in the courts, trying to claim the assets of the Gaudiya Math, and they all were unauthorized. They weren't supposed to do that. They were supposed to just cooperate. They weren't supposed to try to replace Srila Bhaktisiddhanta. So that offense was so grave that still in the 1960s, 30 years later, they weren't able to come together, put aside their differences, and cooperate with the obvious leader. Prabhupada was the only one who had done what Srila Bhaktisiddhanta wanted. So then Prabhupada gave us his Pranam Mantra, and that which Prabhupada quoted, I quoted toward the end of the talk, in a CC purport. Prabhupada mentions that summer of 74, even while he's reasserting his supreme position in ISKCON, he's making it crystal clear in a purport in Adi Leela 1084. I'll read it again. Prabhupada says, as members of the Krishna consciousness movement, we belong to the family or disciplic succession of Saraswati Goswami, and thus we are known as Saraswats. Obeisances are therefore offered to the spiritual master as Saraswat Deva. So now we start to get a little bit of his Pranam Mantra. And this, of course, is 74, 4 years after he'd already given us the Pranam Mantra. But Prabhupada's, he's reminding us in this purport that he's coming in the line of Saraswati Goswami. And we all are, as followers of Prabhupada. Or a member of the Saraswat family. Namaste Saraswati Devi. So that's obeisances to Srila Bhaktisiddhanta, whose mission is to broadcast the cult of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Gauravani Pracharane, and to fight with impersonalists and voidists, Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Desha Tarane. So that's Prabhupada's specific Pranam Mantra. You know, the Namo mantra is a generic mantra. That's a general mantra. But the Namaste mantra is what he gave us that same year, 1970. Namaste Saraswati Devi. Our obeisances are known to you, O spiritual master, servant of Saraswati Goswami. You are so kindly preaching the message of Lord Chaitanya, Paschatya Desh, in these Western countries, so filled with impersonalism and voidism. So Srila Bhaktisiddhanta had wanted all of his disciples to do that, all of his qualified preachers. But he had one at least who took it seriously, and because he took it seriously, he was empowered to turn international people outside the Vedic culture, into Vaishnavas, uniquely empowered because he uniquely surrendered. And so that Pranam Mantra enshrines what Prabhupada is doing. Yeah, so that's Prabhupada's Pranam Mantra to remind us that this was the mission of Saraswati Goswami, and he's doing it. He's the only one doing it. So that's our Founder-Acharya, unique. Empowered by Srila Bhaktisiddhanta, the six Goswamis, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, to do what no one had ever done before. Spread Krishna consciousness all over the world, per the prediction of Mahaprabhu, and later Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur. So, yeah, that's our Prabhupada. Okay, I guess I better move on. So nice being with you all. Great questions. And let me read the transition to the next time, which will be in 2 weeks. Let's see, today is Sunday the 27th. I guess that'll be Sunday the 11th. Sati Prabhu?
I believe so.
Yeah. So in lesson 4, what we'll do is we're going to trace the roots of Srila Prabhupada's mission, from the time he met his Guru Maharaj to the event that triggered his mission's plan. So we're going to go all the way from Prabhupada's first meeting with Srila Bhaktisiddhanta on the rooftop in Calcutta, Altadunga Junction. That was the seed. And then we're going to go all the way to an event that happened in India that actually triggered a strategy for Prabhupada to develop his mission. It's kind of, I know I'm sounding very mysterious there, but I don't want to give away the drama. So it roughly parallels the Lilamrita volume called A Lifetime in Preparation. So that's next time, same place on Zoom, Sunday, October 11th.
Hare Krishna. Thank you, Sureshvara Prabhu, for this wonderful class today. Again and again, you always inspire and remind us of how Srila Prabhupada is important. Thank you for that, and we are looking forward to the next class.
Okay.
Jai Srila Prabhupada.
Thank you. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.